Hello, my name is Jay Chauhan. I am the author of a novel called Love in the Empire. I just want to talk about the subject of a novel that um that I wrote, Love in the Empire, and I want to compare it with the novel that was written by E.M. Forster in 1924 in England by the name of My Passage to India. E.M. Forster wrote and published this novel in about 1924, and he had visited in 1912 India and had seen the Malabar caves and had seen the context of the Indian culture and how in particular it related to the Indian culture and characters in Indian society interacted with the British culture and at that time. In other words, it was between the First World War and the Second World War period of the 19 roughly 20s, in which he described the relationship between the characters. And he's portrayed this novel by creating fictional characters of Dr. Aziz, who's a Muslim doctor in India, and Miss Adela Fielding, who was a British girl who came from England by ship at that time into India, and how she interacted with Dr. Aziz, and how the whole drama played out in the relationship between the two at that period in time. And it's very important to keep the backdrop of the societies, two societies in particular, of the British society that I think in the 19th century and I think by the 20th century, England after the First World War came out emerging as a victorious, consolidated the Indian Empire, and India was a colony of Britain governed by the British Parliament and the Crown of England. And after 1857, when the British took over India by taking over Delhi, the Parliament controlled it. So within a very short time, I would say, after 1857, when the Muslim last ruler of India um, was deposed by the British using Indian soldiers, incidentally, the relationship between Indians and the British changed completely within 50 years to 75 years, which is the time frame from 1857 roughly until the novel was written in 19 about 24 and published that time. So he wrote it just prior to that time. And very important to recognize the historical background which created the characters and relationships between the Indian people and the British people. So just to go back and to understand the relationships, it's very important to understand how the British came to India, and and I think how the relationship changed over a time period. So India was a top economy producing about 25% of the world GDP at the time, produced silk, spices, which all the European people wanted. There were no planes at that time. The people went by ship long voyages, and the Europeans started their migration by ships from Europe to India. And by 1500, a lot of the Europeans were in India. But essentially, the emerging European powers, being France and England, came out victorious, and British essentially took over using the East India Company as a trading company, and they developed their own soldiers, and they basically deposed the last Muslim king of India. And just to go back for you to understand what happened prior to that one, in 1192, the Muslim invaders conquered Delhi and defeated Prithviraj Chauhan. And from then onwards, until the British came, India was governed entirely by Muslim period. The Taj Mahal, the famous monument that everybody knows about, was essentially built by the Muslim emperors in India, but with the Indian taxes that were collected from the Hindu community. The British came and controlled the economics of India and changed the power structure completely in the time frame of the novel of the E.M. Foster. And then, of course, this novel became very famous and very well read in England. And I think what I've tried to do in my novel is to try to illustrate. My novel was published in about 2018, and what I try to explain in this novel is how this power structure relationships have changed. So what I have done in my novel is essentially portray the time period of 1960s, when Britain by that time had decided to basically divest its empire, and that empire history of England of controlling about 60 colonies around the world was basically a termination of the empire history of England that came to an end beginning with 1947, when India became first independent with the efforts of the Mahatma Gandhi, who led the movement not as an elected person, but only as a moral leader in the society. And he, with the Satyagraha, as it is called in the Hindi, or in English, the non-violent movement, created the understanding between the British and the English that the English ought to leave India as a colony and go basically let India become independent. So it was entirely done as an exception to the history of mankind, where all the conquests, right from Alexander, the British, the Persian Empire, and all the other empires had been conquered mostly by military warfare. India illustrated the independence essentially by non-violent means. So this movement, once the British understood that the time had come to end the empire history, in the 1940s onwards, many Asian countries became independent, and the movement of the independence of East Africa and the African countries happened in the 1960s. So the story that I have written is essentially, well, autobiographical style, non-fiction, which essentially is a story that is largely true, but I've changed the characters so that it is not very personal to me, but try to use my experience to illustrate the changing relationship between the British and the people that migrated within the empire history from India to East Africa. And from East Africa, many of the people in the 1960s moved out of East Africa and went to either England, Canada, US, Australia, and some went back to even India. In this time period, what I've illustrated in the novel called Love in the Empire, I try to explain actually what has happened in the educational process that the people went through in East Africa. So I've portrayed the story of what happened in Dar es Salaam, where I was born, and then connected that history with Zanzibar, where there was a history of slavery, and then how the migration of an education and the contact with the British came about, in that a lot of the people in these countries went to England for education, and the Europeans then interacted with Indian characters. So I portrayed the story with the interaction of a character called Arun with a character called Lisa, who is a British girl, and how the relationship between the two played out in this novel. So I think that in those characters intermarried, and then England did not permit at that time, and still in England is in the situation where the top positions in society are only beginning 50, 60 years later to be enjoyed by the people of Indian or other nationalities in the British society. Similar things have happened in Canada and US also. So I think comparing my characters of Arun in interaction and marrying Lisa as a British woman portray what has happened in the 1960s onwards as the trend of migration is reversed in terms of the Indian people and the people who were the people of former colonies went to England and Western countries. I think Canada's history is something similar to what happened in England, because a lot of the British and the French settled in Canada and they enjoyed a different status in terms of relationship with the people of different origins as immigrants to Canada. So this novel, I've illustrated that Arun, who couldn't be a barrister in England, ends up being a barrister in Canada, and how he brought up a family and how he married, had children in Canada, and enjoyed being a barrister, which he couldn't do in England, but it was possible in Canada because society was changing at that time. And the last chapter in this novel illustrates how the Arun character was also able to be a judge in Canada. And as most of the world has seen in the recent history, the the Canada has illustrated, with current, especially with the current Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, that Canada is set on a path of being multicultural society. So this novel that I've written, Love in the Empire, reflects the story of how these changes have taken place and what has happened, the relationship between the different races, and how the changing social structure is taking place in a lot of the Western countries, especially England, Canada, US. I think Germany, if you watch, it has a different history, but I brought a little bit of German history also in the novel, in what happened after the loss of the war by the Germans under the Hitler regime. And they have moved a little bit less forward, but Angela Merkel, as you see in the current history, has tried a lot to rectify the balance between those who are migrating to Germany and how the whole Western world, with Europeans who dominated the Western world and the world culture, is changing in terms of the accommodating the rise of the people who were colonials in the past. So I hope you enjoy the novel. It's on Amazon, Books a Million, and it's also on Barnes and Noble at the present time. I'm trying to get it translated in different languages, starting with Gujarati, which was this language that was spoken by a lot of migrants from India to East Africa. And later I hope to do it also in German and other languages. I hope you enjoy the novel and hope to talk to you again on my website, Love in the Empire, on the Facebook, and hope you watch that as well. Thank you.